if your day has been noisy, we can make the next little while much softer. This chapter focuses on the quiet cosmos of Sumerian gods. In plain terms, the Sumerian religion was a system of beliefs centered on a vast pantheon of deities who governed aspects of the natural and social world. It existed to explain the unpredictability of life, why rivers flooded, why crops grew or failed, why storms rolled across the plains, and to maintain a sense of order through ritual and temple practices. The ancient city of Uruk, one of Sumer's great centers, was home to towering mud brick temples, whose step terraces rose against the deepening blue of twilight. These temples were not just places of worship, but hubs of community life, blending religious function with administrative roles. Clay tablets bearing cuneiform script, recorded offerings, trade agreements, and liturgies, all under the watchful eyes of priests entrusted with maintaining balance between humans and their gods. Among the more than 2,000 gods catalogued by scholars, a few stand out for their roles in shaping this divine network. An, the sky god, held a distant but supreme position, embodying the vastness above the earth. His presence was less about daily interaction and more about an overarching authority, a kind of celestial framework that held the cosmos together. Inanna, in contrast, was a goddess of palpable immediacy, associated with love, war, and fertility. Her influence touched the intimate and the violent alike, weaving through the lives of individuals and the fate of cities. The rituals performed in these temples followed a careful rhythm. Each day, priests prepared offerings of bread, beer, and incense, presenting them on altars crafted from alabaster and copper. The aroma of burning cedar wood mingled with the sweetness of date syrup poured onto carved stone vessels. These acts were not just symbolic, but believed to sustain the gods, who in turn upheld the cosmic order. The odd thing is how practical this relationship feels. An ongoing exchange, almost like a contract, where the god's favor depends on human attention and care. Artisans played a crucial role behind the scenes, shaping sacred objects from lapis lazuli, a deep blue stone prized for its rarity and luster. Small figurines, intricate cylinder seals, and ritual implements made from copper and gold testified to a devotion that extended beyond words and hymns. These materials, sourced from distant regions, linked Sumer to a wider world of trade and cultural exchange. I find it interesting how the physical beauty of these objects carried spiritual weight, as if their very texture and color held a secret message for the devout. Daily temple life also involved managing practical matters: storage of grain, distribution of rations, and maintenance of irrigation systems crucial to farming. The temple was a center where the sacred and the mundane overlapped, a reminder that religion in Sumer was inseparable from everyday survival. This blend of functions might seem complicated, but it made sense in a world where divine will was thought to manifest in the cycles of nature and the flow of the river. The Kesh temple hymn, dated to around 2600 BCE, encapsulates some of these ideas. It praises Enlil, god of wind and breath, as the life force behind the invisible movements shaping the earth and sky. Breath here is more than air. It is the animating principle, the subtle power sustaining all things. Temples dedicated to Enlil held a special status as bridges between the human and the divine, places where the unseen forces could be honored and harmonized. What makes this useful to remember is how ancient peoples perceived the environment, not as inert matter, but as alive, responsive, and intertwined with human destiny. One might picture a priest in the dim morning light, attending to a clay bowl filled with fresh water and pouring it carefully onto a stone altar. Nearby, scribes inscribed the day's offerings onto wet clay tablets, their stylus marks pressing into the soft surface with steady precision. Outside, the river's slow flow echoed the temple's rhythms, a constant reminder of the world's order and fragility. The Sumerian cosmos was vast, layered, and intricate, yet it was grounded in the textures of daily life. The mud brick walls, the scent of incense, the blue glint of lapis lazuli, and the measured steps of priests through shadowed halls. All these details shaped a religion that was neither distant nor abstract, but woven into the fabric of a city and its people. And as we pause here, feel the calm of these timeless teachings, gently guiding you toward restful sleep. Here, we examine breath and wind in the Kesh temple hymn. Breath and wind in the Kesh temple hymn is, what does it mean to call a temple a bridge between earth and sky? Breath and spirit. It existed because it emphasizes the temple as a sacred meeting place of divine and human realms. The useful thing is to understand the ordinary pressure underneath it before the details start to pile up. Now, breath and wind in the Kesh temple hymn. The Kesh temple hymn is an ancient Sumerian poem composed around 2600 BCE, praising Enlil, the god of wind and breath. In plain terms, it is a hymn that celebrates the temple as a sacred space where divine breath, the wind that moves through the world, and human life meet. This hymn existed to mark the temple not just as a building, but as a living link between earth and sky, between the material world and the unseen spirit. The hymn's voice is quietly powerful. It speaks in the language of natural phenomena, where the rising wind carries the breath of Enlil, stirring the landscape and the hearts of worshippers alike. Imagine the temple itself, built of sun-baked mud brick and reed, materials gathered from the nearby fields and marshes, a place shaped as much by the earth as by the hands of its builders. The hymn ties these humble materials to a cosmic breath, suggesting that the wind passing through the reed walls is more than air. It is the very presence of the divine. In the courtyard of a Kesh temple, early morning might bring the subtle rustle of date palm fronds, their slender leaves shifting in the first light breeze. This sound, soft yet continuous, mirrors the hymn's focus on breath as something both gentle and vital. The reed mats, laid out for ritual gatherings, might catch the wind's touch, whispering beneath the feet of priests and pilgrims. These everyday materials and sounds ground the hymn's lofty ideas in a tactile, lived reality. What I find interesting is how the hymn's poetic structure reflects a kind of breath itself. Phrases that seem to inhale and exhale, mirroring the rhythm of wind moving through space. This isn't just a hymn to be read silently. It was likely spoken aloud as part of ritual, its cadence shaping the flow of communal time. Reciting the hymn was a way to align human rhythm with the cycles of nature, binding the community through shared sound and sacred meaning. The temple, then, was not merely a place for individual prayer, but a center for social cohesion, held together by repeated words and the invisible currents of air. The hymn's emphasis on Enlil as god of breath and wind is no accident. In Sumerian thought, breath was closely linked to life and spirit. The very word for breath could also mean spirit or life force. Wind, too, was a powerful symbol. It could bring storms or calm, carry seeds, or scatter dust. Enlil's breath was the breath of creation, the movement that shaped the world and kept it alive. The Kesh temple hymn captures this by describing the temple as the holy mountain where breath and spirit gather, a dwelling for Enlil that connects the heavens with the earth. One might pause to consider how the physical construction of these temples echoed this idea. Mud brick walls were porous, allowing air to circulate, while reed mats and palm fronds were flexible, responsive materials that moved with the slightest breeze. The temple was designed to be part of its environment, not separate from it. This integration of architecture and natural forces feels practical. Mud brick was readily available and insulating. Reed was lightweight and abundant. But it also feels symbolically fitting, given the hymn's focus on breath as a divine essence moving through the world. The ritual recitation of hymns like this one was more than an act of worship. It was a way of enacting the connection between human and divine breath. The priests who chanted these words played a role similar to that of a conductor or a weaver, shaping intangible currents of sound and air into a shared experience. Their voices carried through temple courtyards, mixing with the natural wind, as if joining a larger symphony that included the rustling palms, the distant call of birds, and the shifting desert air. There's a certain quiet irony here. Breath is something so ordinary and constant that we hardly notice it. Yet in the hymn, it becomes the key link to the divine. The part that feels strangely human is this elevation of something we all share and take for granted into a sacred mystery. It reminds us that the boundary between the sacred and the everyday can be surprisingly thin, sometimes just a matter of noticing the wind as more than a breeze. This ancient hymn also helps us see the temple not as a static monument, but as a dynamic place where air and sound move through time. The repetition of these words, the singing or chanting of the hymn, structured communal life by marking moments of worship, celebration, or rest. It created a rhythm that helped people feel connected to each other, to their environment, and to something beyond their immediate world. What makes this useful to remember now is how it gently challenges modern assumptions about sacred spaces and spirituality. The Kesh temple hymn shows a kind of attentiveness to natural elements that we might call ecological or poetic today, but which was simply part of daily life then. It invites us to think about how the rhythms of breath and wind might still carry meaning, even when the gods themselves have become distant stories. And as we pause here, feel the calm of these timeless teachings, gently guiding you toward restful sleep. Now, threads of light in the Rigveda. Threads of light in the Rigveda is how did early hymns use sound and rhythm to touch the mysteries of existence. It existed because it contains hymns, incantations, and ritual instructions focused on natural forces. The useful thing is to understand the ordinary pressure underneath it before the details start to pile up. Now, threads of light in the Rigveda. The Rigveda is the oldest of the 4 Vedas, ancient collections of hymns, chants, and ritual instructions that shaped early Indian religious practice around 1500 BCE. In plain terms, it's a vast anthology of sacred songs meant to be recited aloud during ceremonies, focused mostly on natural forces like fire, wind, and rain, and on gods who personify these powers. These hymns were composed to guide sacrifices that maintained cosmic balance and social order, weaving the human and divine together through sound and rhythm. What makes the Rigveda particularly fascinating is how the act of recitation itself was a kind of living technology, an oral tradition where precise pronunciation and timing were essential. The priests who performed these chants trained for years to master the exact tones and meters, because any slip could be thought to disrupt the intended effect, or worse, the harmony of the universe. The sound wasn't just words. It was an active force meant to call forth fire's warmth, summon rain, or invite the god's presence. This careful preservation of sound patterns feels oddly modern in its insistence on accuracy, yet it was all done long before writing was widespread in the region. Among the many deities celebrated, two stand out for their prominence and symbolic weight: Agni, the fire god, and Indra, the warrior god. Agni was the essential mediator, the divine flame that carried offerings between earth and heaven. The smoke rising from the sacrificial fire was a visible thread connecting the human and celestial realms. Indra, by contrast, was the stormbringer, celebrated for his strength in battles against chaos, often depicted wielding thunderbolts. The hymns dedicated to these figures don't just praise them. They enact a kind of cosmic storytelling, tracing patterns of conflict and renewal that echo the natural cycles of the seasons and weather. The part that feels strangely human about the Rigveda is the attention to the ritual's practical details. For example, the precise measurement of firewood, the careful placement of vessels, the timing of chants with the movement of the sun. All these show a deep integration of spiritual practice with everyday tasks. The priests operated much like skilled artisans or engineers, managing tangible materials and exact sequences to sustain an invisible order. This is a reminder that religious life was not just about belief, but about consistent, repeatable actions that created a rhythm for communities and individuals alike. The hymns themselves, often composed in complex meters, allowed for a kind of musicality that could be both invigorating and soothing. The oral tradition depended on a clear communal memory, passed from teacher to student. It's worth noting how this mode of transmission preserved not only content, but the soundscape, the rise and fall of voices, the pauses, the emphases. You might think of it as an ancient sound recording, preserved in human memory, long before any written script took over. The odd thing is how much effort was put into this precise oral form, suggesting that the sounds held power beyond the meanings of the words themselves. The Rigveda also introduces an idea of cosmic order, called RTA, a principle of natural law and truth that governs both gods and humans. The hymns are meant to align human action with this order through correct ritual and invocation. This concept predates and informs later notions of dharma, which extends the idea of law and duty into social and ethical realms. It's interesting to see how early religious texts like the Rigveda functioned as manuals for living in balance, not just with the divine, but with the natural world and community. One practical detail that often surprises people is the use of natural materials in ritual settings. For example, The fire altar was constructed from carefully shaped bricks, often red or white clay, arranged in specific geometric patterns. The precision of these constructions was thought to affect the efficacy of the sacrifice. It's a reminder that these ancient ceremonies involved tactile skills, craftsmanship, and an intimate knowledge of local resources, tied closely to the environment. I find it interesting how the Rigveda's hymns still resonate through time, influencing not only later Hindu traditions, but also how we think about sound, ritual, and the relationship between humans and nature. The insistence on oral precision echoes in modern practices like chant and mantra recitation, highlighting a continuity of tradition that feels surprisingly tangible given the vast span of millennia. As we pause here, feel the calm of these timeless teachings, gently guiding you toward restful sleep. This chapter focuses on meditation and mystery in the Upanishads. Meditation and mystery in the Upanishads is what gentle insights about being and knowing emerged from these whispered philosophical texts. It existed because they explore meditation, the nature of the self, Atman, and ultimate reality, Brahman. The useful thing is to understand the ordinary pressure underneath it before the details start to pile up. Now, meditation and mystery in the Upanishads. The Upanishads are a collection of ancient Sanskrit texts composed between roughly 800 and 400 BCE in what we now call India. In plain terms, they mark a thoughtful turn away from the outward rituals of earlier Vedic religion toward inward reflection on the nature of self and reality. These texts were created to answer deeper questions. Who am I beneath all appearances? What is the ultimate ground of existence? And how might one come to know that truth directly? Unlike the loud communal ceremonies of the earlier Vedas, the Upanishads invite a quieter, more personal engagement. Their teachings often unfold as conversations between a teacher and a student, set in the shade of a tree or beside a river, where the sounds of wind or water mingle with words of contemplation. These dialogues revolve around the concept of Atman, the inner self or soul, and Brahman, the vast, unchanging reality behind all things. The Upanishads suggest that understanding the unity of Atman and Brahman is the key to liberation from suffering and the cycle of rebirth. The texts themselves are written on palm leaves or birch bark, fragile materials that remind us how close these ideas came to being lost. They were preserved by careful memorization, a demanding task requiring months or years of practice. The precise recitation of syllables was crucial, not only for preserving meaning, but because the sounds themselves were believed to carry spiritual power. I find it interesting how this emphasis on sound and breath connects meditation with language as a living, breathing practice. One notable feature of the Upanishadic dialogues is their paradoxical style. Teachers respond to students' questions with riddles or silence, inviting them to look beyond ordinary logic. For example, the Chandogya Upanishad tells of a student named Svetaketu, who learns that the essence of all things is subtle, invisible, and yet present within himself. The teacher's patience and the setting, a quiet grove, highlight how learning was as much a lived experience as an intellectual exercise. The Upanishads also introduce meditation techniques that focus on breath control, mantra repetition, and mental concentration. These practices were designed to still the restless mind, allowing the seeker to perceive the self's true nature beyond the distractions of everyday life. It's worth noting that unlike some later meditative traditions, the Upanishads do not prescribe fixed postures or elaborate rituals. Instead, they emphasize inner readiness and attentive listening, qualities that are accessible in many settings. What makes these texts especially fascinating is how they represent a shift from external duty to internal awareness. Earlier Vedic religion centered on precise sacrifices to maintain cosmic order, often involving fire altars and complex ceremonies performed by priests. The Upanishads, by contrast, direct attention inward, suggesting that true knowledge and liberation arise not from ritual correctness, but from self-understanding. This transition reflects broader social and philosophical changes in the time period as communities sought new answers to enduring human questions. The part that feels strangely human is how these ancient dialogues resemble a teacher's patient guidance, much like anyone might offer when helping a friend navigate confusion or doubt. The emphasis on questions, pauses, and reflections creates a rhythm that invites quiet patience rather than rushing to conclusions. The Upanishads do not serve up answers on a platter. They gently encourage the listener to explore and discover. The influence of the Upanishads extends far beyond their own time. They laid the groundwork for many later South Asian spiritual traditions, including various schools of Hindu philosophy, Buddhism, and even Jainism. Concepts like karma, dharma, and moksha, often associated with Indian religions, have roots that trace back to these texts. Understanding this helps us appreciate how ideas about self and reality have evolved over millennia, shaped by ongoing reflection and adaptation. One practical detail often overlooked is the role of the teacher's voice and the natural environment in these teachings. Recitations might take place outdoors, where the rustling leaves and flowing streams become part of the experience, lending a kind of organic rhythm to the words. This setting contrasts with the formal temple rituals of the time and suggests a lived relationship between spiritual insight and the natural world. The part I find useful to remember is that many of these early teachings were designed for everyday life, not just grand ceremonies. At a glance, the Upanishads might seem abstract or distant, but they emerge from a very human desire to understand who we truly are beneath the noise of daily concerns. The emphasis on meditation and mystery encourages a quiet attentiveness that feels, even now, like a thoughtful way to approach life's big questions without haste or spectacle. And as we pause here, feel the calm of these timeless teachings gently guiding you toward restful sleep. Here we examine Mani's vision, a religion of light and shadow. Mani's vision, a religion of light and shadow, is how did Manichaeism weave together threads from distant faiths into a tapestry of duality? It existed because combined elements from Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Buddhism. The useful thing is to understand the ordinary pressure underneath it before the details start to pile up. Now, Mani's vision, a religion of light and shadow. Manichaeism was founded in the 3rd century CE by a man named Mani, who lived in the region of Mesopotamia, what we now roughly call Iraq. In plain terms, Manichaeism is a dualistic religion that presents the world as a battleground between two opposing forces, light and darkness. This cosmic struggle was an attempt to explain the presence of both good and evil in the world, offering followers a way to understand the complexity of existence and their place within it. Mani's teaching combined elements from Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Buddhism, weaving them into a unique tapestry that sought to transcend the divisions of his time. The religion spread across vast distances, from the deserts of North Africa to the Silk Road cities of China, flourishing for several centuries before quietly fading from view. What remains today are fragments of texts and archaeological traces that hint at a deeply thoughtful, if now vanished, spiritual tradition. At the heart of Manichaean belief lay the idea of two eternal realms, the kingdom of light and the kingdom of darkness. These were not merely symbols, but real, opposing substances locked in conflict. The light was associated with goodness, knowledge, purity, and the divine, while darkness represented ignorance, materiality, and evil. Mani described this duality in vivid terms, imagining light as a radiant substance trapped within the physical world, yearning to return to its original source. Followers of Manichaeism were encouraged to live ascetic lives, emphasizing purity and knowledge as means to liberate the light within themselves. They practiced fasting, refrained from violence, and often avoided certain foods thought to be too connected to darkness. This practical discipline was less about punishment and more about careful stewardship of one's inner light. The part that feels strangely human here is how much attention was paid to daily habits, the measurement of food, the timing of prayers, even the choice of clothing, to maintain a clear boundary between light and shadow. The religion's texts were written in several languages, Syriac, Middle Persian, and Coptic among them, reflecting its wide geographical reach. Manuscripts found in desert caves and ancient libraries reveal a carefully structured cosmology and moral code. One particularly interesting manuscript, the Kephalaya, gathers teachings and stories attributed to Mani himself. These writings combine poetic imagery with clear doctrinal instructions, balancing mysticism with practical guidance. Manichaeism's dualism extended beyond abstract theology into a kind of metaphysical geography. The material world was a mixture of light and darkness, but the soul's origin was always in the light. The physical body was seen as a prison for the soul's radiant essence, and death was liberation. This view shaped rituals and ceremonies focused on freeing the trapped light, often through the symbolic use of fire or water, elements seen as purifying agents. I find it interesting how these elemental symbols appear across many cultures, yet here they serve a very precise metaphysical function. The religion's decline is a story of gradual disappearance rather than sudden collapse. As Manichaeism encountered the rise of Islam in the Middle East and other dominant religious traditions consolidated power, its communities shrank. Some scholars suggest that its emphasis on knowledge and inner light made it less accessible to broader populations over time, compared to more community-focused religions. The irony is that a faith so committed to spreading light eventually receded into shadows, leaving only traces for later generations to piece together. Archaeological finds, such as Manichaean wall paintings in the Turpan oasis of Western China, or inscriptions in North Africa, give us glimpses of how the faith was practiced in diverse settings. These sites reveal a striking blend of artistic traditions, Persian motifs alongside Chinese brushwork, for instance, illustrating the religion's adaptability and syncretic nature. The practical challenge of maintaining such a broad and diverse network must have been immense, especially in a pre-modern world of difficult travel and communication. One practical judgment worth noting is how Manichaeism's strict asceticism may have limited its long-term appeal. While its teachings offered a profound answer to the problem of evil, the daily sacrifices demanded could be hard to sustain for many. This trade-off between spiritual rigor and communal growth is a familiar one in the history of religions. The balance between maintaining purity and welcoming new adherents is delicate, and Manichaeism leaned strongly toward the former. What makes this useful to remember is that Manichaeism's vision is not just an ancient curiosity, but a thoughtful attempt to grapple with universal questions. Why does darkness exist alongside light? And how might we live in a world where both are real? Mani's synthesis shows a remarkable openness to different traditions, a willingness to borrow and adapt without losing sight of a core message. It's a reminder that religious ideas often travel and transform, shaped by the places and people they touch. And as we pause here, feel the calm of these timeless teachings, gently guiding you toward restful sleep. Now, the puzzle of the Meroitic script. The puzzle of the Meroitic script is what secrets might the mysterious Meroitic language hold about ancient beliefs. It existed because the script remains largely undeciphered, despite many inscriptions found. The useful thing is to understand the ordinary pressure underneath it before the details start to pile up. Now, the puzzle of the Meroitic script. The Meroitic script is an ancient writing system used in the kingdom of Meroe, located in what is now Sudan, roughly between 300 BCE and 400 CE. In plain terms, it is a set of symbols carved or painted on stone tablets, temple walls, and funerary objects, meant to record language and ideas. This script served as a tool for administration, religious expression, and perhaps royal propaganda, helping the people of Meroe manage their kingdom and articulate their beliefs. Despite the many inscriptions unearthed around archaeological sites, like the temples of Nakha and Musawarat-es-Sufra, the Meroitic script remains largely undeciphered. The letters themselves are known, thanks to early attempts and some bilingual texts with Egyptian hieroglyphs. But the language they represent has resisted a full translation. This leaves a kind of quiet mystery hanging over the civilization's religious and cultural life, as scholars piece together fragments without the full picture. Walking through the ruins of Meroe under a moonlit sky, one might notice the carefully carved stelae lining what must once have been bustling sacred spaces. These slabs of sandstone display the repetitive lines of Meroitic script, their sharp incisions catching the faint silver light. The effect is like a frozen chant, a series of symbols waiting patiently for a voice, yet remaining mute. The fact that these writings are often found on temple walls or tombs suggests they carried prayers, spells, or records of divine favor. But the exact content, whether hymns, myths, or legal decrees, remains a puzzle. The script itself is composed of two main forms: hieroglyphic, used mostly for monumental inscriptions, and cursive, found on papyrus or wooden surfaces. The hieroglyphs show a clear Egyptian influence, reflecting centuries of contact between Nubia and Egypt. Yet Meroitic signs are distinct, with their own shapes and patterns that don't neatly match Egyptian hieroglyphs or alphabets. This mix hints at a culture both connected to and independent from its northern neighbor, adopting useful tools but reshaping them to fit local needs. What's particularly interesting is the practical complexity of the Meroitic script. It's partly alphabetic, with signs for vowels and consonants, yet some scholars think it also incorporates syllabic elements. This hybrid nature complicates decipherment, especially since no substantial bilingual texts, like the Rosetta Stone for Egyptian, have been found. This means that without a reliable key, linguistic work relies heavily on guesswork, comparisons to related languages, and statistical analysis of symbol patterns. If you're still up and listening, feel free to like and subscribe. It helps out big time with the algorithm. The undeciphered state of Meroitic leaves much about the spiritual life of Meroe in shadow. We know from archaeological context that religion was significant. Temples dedicated to deities like Apedemac, a lion-headed warrior god, abound. Sculptures and reliefs depict ritual scenes, and the placement of inscriptions inside these sacred structures strongly suggests a ritual or magical function. Yet without understanding the words, the stories behind these images remain mostly speculative. The part that feels strangely human is this. Even with all our technology and linguistic tools, some ancient voices simply choose to remain silent. It's worth noting how this undeciphered script challenges our assumptions about history and knowledge. We often think that writing guarantees understanding, that conservation means clarity. But here, preservation has created a gap, a record that is simultaneously present and absent. The stone is weathered but intact, the script visible but opaque. The task of translation becomes less a matter of reading and more like listening for a faint murmur in a language no longer spoken. One practical takeaway from this is the reminder of how fragile cultural memory is. The kingdom of Meroe thrived for centuries, yet its language and much of its worldview have slipped beyond reach. The scripts carved into temple walls are like echoes trapped in stone, waiting for a future listener with the right ear. This lends a curious humility to the study of extinct religions. So much of what shaped human belief slips through the cracks of time, leaving fragments that tease without revealing. The archaeological finds themselves tell a story of careful ritual practice and social organization. The inscriptions often accompany images of offerings or royal ceremonies, linking text and image in a way that suggests the words carried power. The stones, the pigments, the chisels. These are all tools used to translate human intention into a form meant to endure. Yet the odd thing is, the message itself is still lost. Like a letter written in a forgotten code. I find it interesting that the people of Meroe might have understood their writings perfectly well, using them in daily religious and administrative life, while we today face the silence of their script. This gap invites a kind of respectful patience, a willingness to sit with the unknown rather than rush to fill it with assumptions. As we contemplate these silent stones and undeciphered symbols under a Nubian night sky, there is a subtle lesson about the limits of knowledge and the persistence of mystery. The puzzle of the Meroitic script reminds us that not all ancient wisdom is immediately accessible, and some teachings remain hidden, inviting quiet reflection rather than quick answers. And as we pause here, feel the calm of these timeless teachings, gently guiding you toward restful sleep. This chapter focuses on sacred spaces, particularly temples understood as living places. In plain terms, temples were not just buildings for worship, but dynamic centers where divine presence, community life, and worldly power intertwined. These spaces existed to bring people closer to their gods, organize religious practice, and often to anchor the social and political order of a city or kingdom. Temples often rose from local materials, shaped by the craftsmanship and resources available nearby. In ancient Mesopotamia, for example, mud brick was the staple, sun-dried and layered thickly to form sturdy walls that could hold cool shadows inside. Stone was rarer but prized, used for doorways or statues, while cedar wood, imported with great effort, framed doors and ceilings. The choice of material was never just practical. It connected the temple to its environment, rooting the sacred in the very earth and landscape the people knew. The architecture itself frequently echoed cosmic ideas. Columns might resemble towering palm trunks or mountain peaks, symbolizing a bridge between earth and sky. The temple's layout, often a series of nested rooms leading to a central sanctuary, reflected a journey inward, from the noisy outer world to a quiet inner sanctum, where the divine dwelt. This spatial progression was a kind of map for worshippers, guiding their senses and attention toward a deeper encounter with the sacred. Inside these spaces, rituals unfolded with a measured rhythm. Incense smoke curled slowly upward, carrying scents of frankincense or myrrh, light and resinous against the heavier stone and wood. Priests and attendants moved through their tasks, lighting oil lamps in shallow clay bowls, arranging offerings of grain and fruit on polished altars, chanting hymns in languages that had long ago settled into sacred sound. The repetition of these actions, day after day, maintained the temple's presence as a living entity, continually renewed by human care. The daily upkeep was a serious responsibility. Temple workers swept courtyards with bundled twigs, refilled water basins, polished statues with oils, and repaired cracked bricks before the weather could do worse damage. These tasks were small but vital, ensuring the temple's physical and spiritual integrity. What I find interesting is how this maintenance mirrored the religious idea itself. Just as the temple needed tending, so too did the relationship between people and gods require constant attention. Sacred spaces were more than places for individual devotion. They functioned as communal hubs. Markets often clustered nearby, and festivals drew crowds who came not only to pray, but to trade, celebrate, and meet news from distant lands. Temples were centers of learning too, where scribes recorded history and rituals, and where priests studied the movements of stars or the timing of the seasons. Practical knowledge bound to spiritual meaning. If you're still up and listening, feel free to like and subscribe. It helps out big time with the algorithm. The temple's design also reflected a practical balance between openness and enclosure. Large courtyards welcomed gatherings, while inner sanctuaries remained restricted, accessible only to a few. This separation created a sacred hierarchy of space, where the ordinary and the divine could coexist without confusion or disrespect. I find it quietly reassuring how this architectural carefulness anticipated modern ideas about boundaries between public and private, seen and unseen. Light played a subtle but powerful role. During the day, sunlight filtered unevenly through latticed windows or gaps in stone screens, creating shifting patterns on worn floors. At night, oil lamps flickered in shadows, their warm glow softening the carved details of reliefs and statues. The careful placement of light sources was no accident. It enhanced the mood of mystery and reverence, inviting a contemplative state. What makes this useful to remember is that temples, as living places, were less about grandiosity and more about sustaining a continuous relationship, a mutual presence between people, gods, and the environment. This ongoing dialogue shaped the rhythms of daily life, from the rising of the sun to the quiet closing of temple doors after evening prayers. In many traditions, the temple itself was seen as a microcosm of the universe. Walls might be inscribed with images of stars or rivers, symbolizing the cosmos held in miniature. The temple thus became a tactile, inhabitable symbol of order amidst chaos. A place where the unseen patterns of existence could be glimpsed and honored. The part that feels strangely human is how these temples, despite their grandeur or mystery, depended on countless small, practical tasks and hands. From mixing mud for bricks to tuning a stringed instrument for a hymn, the sacred was woven through everyday work. This blend of the mundane and the divine reminds us that no matter the faith or era, the built environment shapes how people experience their beliefs. As we pause here, feel the calm of these timeless teachings gently guiding you toward restful sleep. Here we examine ritual rhythms and the passage of time. Ritual rhythms and the passage of time is what quiet patterns connected people to nature and the divine through ritual. It existed because festivals and sacrifices punctuated the year, creating communal rhythm. The useful thing is to understand the ordinary pressure underneath it before the details start to pile up. Now, ritual rhythms and the passage of time. Ritual rhythms are the repeated patterns of ceremonies and observances that marked the flow of days, months, and years in many traditional religions. In plain terms, they were a way to organize time itself, not simply by clocks or calendars, but through shared acts that connected people to the seasons, to the cycles of nature, and to the sacred order behind existence. These patterns helped communities orient themselves, providing a sense of continuity and renewal in the face of change. In ancient Mesopotamia, for example, the Sumerians observed religious calendars closely tied to agricultural cycles. The year was punctuated by festivals celebrating planting, harvest, and celestial events. Each festival was a distinct moment in time, marked by specific rituals, offerings, sacrifices, and public processions. These gatherings were not just about devotion, but about aligning human activity with the rhythms of earth and sky. The Sumerian calendar itself was interwoven with lunar and solar observations, a system requiring careful watchfulness of the moon's phases and the sun's position. What's interesting here is how these ceremonies served as practical markers as much as spiritual ones. The priests, often trained astronomers, monitored the heavens using clay tablets inscribed with star charts and lunar cycles. Their calculations dictated when to begin sowing fields or when to hold the New Year festival, known as Akitu. This was no mere superstition. It was a necessary coordination for survival in a land where the river's flooding could mean the difference between plenty and famine. In parts of ancient India, the Rigveda, and later the Upanishads, describe similar seasonal and cosmic rhythms, but with a different texture. The Rigveda's hymns, composed around 1500 BCE, include chants timed to sunrise and sunset, invoking deities associated with fire, wind, and dawn. These ceremonies were often accompanied by music, flutes, drums, and the rhythmic chanting of priests. The repetition of these sounds, combined with precise timings, created a temporal framework that was both communal and meditative. The odd thing is how this pattern of sound and silence itself becomes a kind of ritualized timekeeping, more felt than measured. Some rituals involved symbolic acts that seemed to pause or reset time itself. In Manichaeism, for example, light and darkness were eternal forces locked in struggle. Rituals often symbolized this cosmic battle, using light-bearing candles or reflective surfaces to represent the triumph of illumination over shadow. The timing of these acts, especially around solstices or equinoxes, was crucial. They marked moments when the balance of light and dark shifted, and the community's participation was a way of renewing cosmic harmony. These ceremonies also relied heavily on roles. Not everyone took part in every step. Priests performed complex rites, elders guided communal observance, and ordinary members joined in shared meals or dances. This division of labor created a rhythm within the community itself, a social choreography that mirrored the larger cycles they honored. I find it interesting how this social structure, embedded in ritual timings, reinforced the stability of the group as much as it did the cosmos. The materials used in these ceremonies added texture to the passage of time. Take, for instance, the use of woven reeds or palm leaves in ancient temples. These materials were crafted into mats or ritual objects that were laid down and collected at precise moments, marking transitions between phases of a festival. The wear and replacement of these items over years created a subtle layering of time, visible in the slight fray of fibers or the fading of natural dyes. It's a reminder that time was not only counted, but experienced through tactile, everyday objects. One might also consider the quiet work of preparing ritual spaces, sweeping courtyards, arranging stones, or lighting incense. These tasks were often done at set hours, their repetition a background pulse to the larger ceremonies. The scent of resin or the feel of smooth stone under hands became part of the ritual's temporal fabric, anchoring moments that might otherwise slip away. What makes this useful to remember is how ordinary actions, repeated and timed, can become profound markers of time's passage. Sometimes, the timing of rituals solved practical problems too. For example, timing sacrifices or offerings to coincide with the moon's cycles could ensure that food or drink used in ceremonies was fresh, or that gatherings took place during predictable weather patterns. This integration of natural cycles with human activity formed a system where time was not abstract but lived. In the taste of fresh bread, the coolness of evening air, the lengthening of shadows. In reflecting on these ancient rhythms, what strikes me most is their patience. Time was not hurried forward, but unfolded in measured steps, each one observed carefully and collectively. This is very different from today's relentless clock-driven pace. The part that feels strangely human is how these ritual rhythms gave shape to the uncertainty of life, offering a steady beat to rest against, even when the future was unclear. And as we pause here, feel the calm of these timeless teachings, gently guiding you toward restful sleep. Now, words as bridges, oral tradition, and memory. Words Words as bridges. Oral tradition and memory is how did ancient peoples preserve sacred knowledge without writing or with fragile scripts? It existed because memorization techniques included repetition, rhythm, and melody. The useful thing is to understand the ordinary pressure underneath it before the details start to pile up. Now, words as bridges between generations and worlds. Oral tradition is the passing of sacred stories, teachings, and songs by spoken word alone, often without writing or with only fragile partial scripts. This method solved a very practical problem: how to keep knowledge alive across seasons, migrations, or when ink and paper were scarce or vulnerable. It made the human voice itself a living library, entrusted to individuals and communities who remembered not just facts, but rhythms, melodies, and gestures. In many vanished religions, oral transmission was the main way the sacred was preserved. Take, for example, the Sumerian hymns. While some were eventually inscribed on clay tablets, the earliest versions likely circulated through recitation, carried by temple priests who spent long hours memorizing intricate liturgies. These recitations were not dry lectures, but performances, carefully measured in syllables and melody to aid memory. The repetition of key phrases, the cadence of the lines, and the ritual context all reinforced recall. The Kesh temple hymn, dedicated to Enlil, would have been intoned with a precise rhythm, echoing the breath and wind it celebrates. This intertwining of sound and sacred meaning made the spoken word itself a kind of bridge between the human and divine, past and present. What I find interesting is how oral tradition built in redundancy by design. Stories and hymns were repeated in cycles, sometimes daily or seasonally, so that forgetting was less likely. Elders acted as custodians of this knowledge, often recognized for their remarkable memory and authority. In the case of the Rigveda, composed around 1500 BCE, the hymns were preserved through generations of Brahmin priests who developed elaborate systems of recitation. They used not just repetition, but also cross patterns, like chanting lines forwards and backwards to ensure accuracy. This was painstaking work, but it allowed the complex Vedic text to survive for centuries before being written down. Oral transmission was also social. Storytelling and chanting happened in communal spaces, the shade of a tree, a village square, or near a fire at night. These gatherings reinforced group identity and belief through shared experience. The storyteller, or ritual specialist, held a unique role, weaving voices and listeners into a shared moment of sacred connection. The performance aspect helped anchor abstract ideas in tangible, sensory experience. Voices rising and falling, the rustle of leaves, the flicker of flames. One small practical trade-off was that oral traditions could be vulnerable to change or loss if the chain of memory was broken. This partly explains why some religions began to adopt writing, as seen in the gradual transition from oral Vedic hymns to written Sanskrit texts in India, or the eventual inscription of Sumerian hymns on clay. But this transition was selective and slow. Writing was expensive and often reserved for elite uses. Oral teaching remained the backbone of religious life for common people and ritual specialists alike. The Meroitic religion, with its still undeciphered script, reminds us of this delicate balance between spoken and written word. Because scholars cannot yet read the texts, our understanding depends heavily on archaeological context and comparison to neighboring traditions. It's likely that much of what was important remained in oral form, performed and remembered rather than fixed in ink. This underlines how oral tradition was not a fallback, but a sophisticated mode of knowledge, one shaped by material realities, social organization, and reverence for sound. This method also allowed ideas to evolve gently. While the core was preserved, small variations could arise, adapting teachings to new contexts or audiences. The Upanishads, for instance, carry traces of such dynamic oral transmission. Their philosophical reflections often come in dialogic form, suggesting they were spoken and heard, not just read. This fluidity contrasts with the fixity of written texts, offering a kind of living conversation across centuries. What makes this useful to remember is how much of human culture still depends on oral transmission, whether in storytelling, music, or ritual. Even today, it's a reminder that sound, memory, and community are deeply intertwined. The odd thing is that we sometimes assume writing is the only way to preserve knowledge reliably, but oral traditions show a remarkable resilience and subtlety, especially when combined with performance and social reinforcement. As we think about vanished religions, it's worth appreciating the voices that once carried these teachings, voices shaped by the materials of their world, the dry air of Mesopotamia, the cedar wood of temple doors, the crackling of fire at night, the soft murmur of a river nearby. These sounds were the threads tying past to present, sacred to human, and memory to meaning. And as we pause here, feel the calm of these timeless teachings, gently guiding you toward restful sleep. This chapter focuses on philosophical echoes in lost teachings. Philosophical echoes in lost teachings is what enduring questions and insights survive from vanished religions. It existed because questions about life, death, and the cosmos appear in many texts. The useful thing is to understand the ordinary pressure underneath it before the details start to pile up. Now, philosophical echoes in lost teachings. This chapter focuses on the lingering ideas and reflections found in religions that no longer have living communities or fully accessible texts. In plain terms, it's about the surviving fragments of ancient spiritual thought, those questions about existence, the self, and the cosmos, that remain faintly audible even when the original voices have quieted. These teachings existed to help people understand their place in the world, to offer frameworks for meaning, and to shape the rhythms of daily life and ritual. Much of what these vanished traditions considered central, duality between light and dark, the unity underlying diversity, the nature of the soul, still quietly informs how we think about ourselves today. The Sumerians, for example, with their vast pantheon, including gods like An, the sky deity, and Inanna, goddess of love and war, explored the tension between order and chaos, the divine and the human. Their religious hymns, such as the Kesh temple hymn, celebrated the breath and wind as sacred forces, subtly weaving together the physical and spiritual realms. The odd thing is how these ideas, expressed in cuneiform tablets pressed into clay, feel surprisingly modern in their concern for balance and the unseen forces shaping life. Manichaeism, founded by Mani in the 3rd century CE, offers another layer of philosophical depth. This religion synthesized elements from Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Buddhism, centering on a stark dualism of light and darkness, good and evil. Though Manichaeism eventually faded from common practice, its influence rippled through time, echoing in later mystical and Gnostic movements. Its texts, scattered and fragmentary, suggest a worldview deeply concerned with the soul's journey through a world caught between opposing forces. What I find interesting is how Mani's vision tried to reconcile such a profound duality with a practical spirituality accessible to many, a kind of ancient balance sheet of cosmic forces. The Meroitic kingdom in Nubia left behind inscriptions in a script still undeciphered. This gap in understanding makes the religious teachings embedded in those texts tantalizingly out of reach. Archaeological finds, temple ruins, statues, ritual objects offer clues, but the exact nature of their philosophy remains largely a mystery. This absence reminds us how fragile the transmission of spiritual knowledge can be, and how much is lost when language fades. Yet even without the words, the arrangement of Meroitic temples, the careful placement of offerings, and the enduring reverence for certain animals or symbols suggest a worldview attentive to cycles of life, death, and rebirth. Across many lost religions, a recurring theme is the interplay of ritual and reflection. Rituals, performed in temples built of mud brick or stone, timed to the cycles of moon and sun, were not merely ceremonies, but embodied philosophies. They enacted beliefs about the cosmos and the self, turning abstract ideas into lived experience. This practical philosophy grounded people in their environment and community. For instance, the Upanishads, composed in ancient India between 800 and 400 BCE, mark a philosophical shift from ritual action to inward meditation and inquiry. They ask, what is the self? How does it relate to the ultimate reality, Brahman? These questions remain deeply relevant, illustrating how spiritual inquiry often migrates from outward acts to inward understanding. It's worth noting how oral tradition shaped the survival of many teachings. Before texts, or alongside them, stories, hymns, and philosophical ideas were memorized, recited, and refined across generations. This process blurred the line between fixed doctrine and living interpretation, making spiritual knowledge both stable and adaptable. The Rigveda, dating to around 1500 BCE, embodies this blend, a collection of hymns that are simultaneously ritual instruction and metaphysical speculation. The layered meanings within these hymns invite listeners to engage with fundamental questions without expecting definitive answers. What makes this useful to remember is that the loss of texts or entire religious communities doesn't erase the human questions they grappled with. Instead, these echoes persist in the philosophies that followed, in cultural practices, and even in the quiet moments when one contemplates life's mysteries. The philosophical reflections in these extinct religions often revolved around core human concerns: the nature of good and evil, the origin of the soul, the cycle of life and death, and the search for harmony within a complex world. In practice, reconstructing these teachings requires patience and humility. Scholars sift through fragmentary texts, scattered artifacts, and comparative studies, aware that any interpretation is provisional. For example, the undeciphered Meroitic script leaves gaps that invite thoughtful reconstruction rather than confident assertion. This process mirrors how the original practitioners might have approached their own mysteries, with respect for the unknown and openness to multiple meanings. One small practical detail I find oddly human is how these ancient thinkers often used everyday materials: clay tablets, reed pens, stone altars, woven textiles, not just as tools, but as integral parts of their spiritual expression. The weight of a clay tablet or the texture of a woven cloth carried meaning, grounding lofty ideas in tangible experience. This connection between material and metaphysical reminds us that philosophy rarely floats free from the things we touch and handle. As we pause here, feel the calm of these timeless teachings gently guiding you toward restful sleep. Here we examine the materials of faith, tools and tokens. The materials of faith. Tools and tokens is what everyday materials became vessels of belief and memory. It existed because incense burners, lamps, and offering bowls were common ritual tools. The useful thing is to understand the ordinary pressure underneath it before the details start to pile up. Now, the materials of faith. Tools and tokens. In plain terms, this means the physical objects that ancient religions used in their practice. Things like tablets, amulets, lamps, incense burners, and offering bowls. These objects were not mere decoration. They served practical functions and carried symbolic meaning, connecting people to their beliefs in a tactile and immediate way. In ancient Mesopotamia, for example, clay tablets were the primary medium for recording religious hymns, laws, and prayers. The Sumerians pressed wedge-shaped signs into soft clay using a stylus made of reed, then baked the tablets in the sun, or kiln fired them to preserve the text. These tablets were durable enough to survive millennia, which is why we still have access to fragments of the Kesh temple hymn, among others. The act of inscribing on clay was itself a ritual of permanence, turning fleeting breath or speech into something solid, almost eternal. One particularly worn tablet from the early dynastic period shows faint impressions of cuneiform signs, the marks seeming to float across the surface like tiny steps in a path. The edges are rounded and chipped in places, evidence of centuries of handling, perhaps passed from scribe to priest, or from temple to archive. The feel of such an object confirms something important. Faith was often held in the hands, not only in the mind. In addition to written records, ritual tools often involved natural materials chosen for their symbolic or practical qualities. Bronze lamps, for instance, were common in temples and homes alike. Their shallow bowls held oil, usually sesame or castor, and a simple wick made from flax or reed. Lighting such a lamp was a daily practice, a small offering to divine presence. The flickering flame was both a source of light and a living metaphor for life and spirit. The smell of burning oil, mingled with the resinous scent of frankincense or myrrh, created an atmosphere where the mundane and the sacred blended. Incense burners, sometimes made of ceramics or bronze, were crafted with care. One example from the late Bronze Age features a perforated lid shaped like a lion's head, its open jaws releasing fragrant smoke. The choice of lion imagery may have invoked strength or protection, common themes in many religious traditions. The slow release of incense smoke was a kind of prayer in itself, rising invisibly. It symbolized the journey of human devotion toward the divine. Offering bowls were another everyday object with sacred purpose. Made from clay, stone, or metal. These vessels held food, drink, or precious substances presented to gods or ancestors. Their shapes varied, from simple round dishes to elaborately decorated cups with incised patterns or painted motifs. Some bore symbols like the 8-pointed star associated with the goddess Inanna, or the sun disk linked to the god Shamash. These signs were reminders of the divine presence embedded in the objects themselves. Jewelry and amulets carried a similar weight. Small pendants carved from carnelian, lapis lazuli, or green feldspar were worn for protection or to invoke blessings. One Sumerian amulet depicts a stylized eye, a motif that appears in many cultures as a safeguard against harm or evil. The materials chosen were not random. Lapis lazuli, a deep blue stone, was prized for its rarity and association with the heavens. Carnelian, with its warm reddish hue, suggested vitality and life force. The odd thing is how these objects, made from everyday substances, clay, bronze, stone, organic fibers, became vessels of belief and memory. The choice of material linked the physical world to spiritual concepts. Clay connected to earth and creation. Bronze, a metal of transformation and resilience. Stones carried colors that evoked sky, fire, or fertility. Craftsmanship in these objects was both a practical skill and a form of devotion. The hands shaping a bowl or carving a symbol were themselves engaged in a sacred act. What I find interesting is the trade-off between durability and accessibility. Clay tablets could last for thousands of years, but required specialized knowledge to create and interpret. Amulets and jewelry, by contrast, were portable and personal, worn close to the body and part of daily life. They made faith tangible and immediate, accessible to those who might not read the complex hymns or legal codes. In Manichaeism, which spread across vast distances from North Africa to China, ritual objects also played a key role. Lamps, incense burners, and sacred textiles were used to mark the dualistic struggle between light and darkness. Here, the materials themselves, light-giving oil, fragrant smoke, shining fabric, embodied spiritual principles. The ritual environment invited participants to feel the presence of cosmic forces through senses, not just words. Even where we lack full understanding, as with the Meroitic language of Nubia, archaeological finds reveal similar patterns. Objects like inscribed pottery, amulets, and offering vessels show that physical tokens formed a shared language of faith. The materials chosen were often local but carefully crafted, suggesting a link between community identity and religious practice. The part that feels strangely human about all this is how these tools and tokens functioned as bridges between the intangible and the concrete. They were ways for people to hold their beliefs in their hands, to see, touch, and wear the sacred. In a world without printed books or digital screens, faith was inseparable from the materials that shaped everyday experience. And as we pause here, feel the calm of these timeless teachings gently guiding you toward restful sleep. Now, returning to the quiet night. Returning to the quiet night is how these silent echoes of vanished faiths continue to invite peaceful reflection. It existed because their teachings blend ritual, philosophy, and daily life in subtle ways. The useful thing is to understand the ordinary pressure underneath it before the details start to pile up. Now, returning to the quiet night invites us to consider how the teachings of extinct religions continue to ripple softly through time. In plain terms, this is the act of revisiting old beliefs, not as a scholar or a devotee, but as a curious observer of human attempts to understand existence. These vanished faiths serve to map the unknown, to hold communities together, and to give shape to the mysteries of life and death. Their remnants often feel like faint stars in an otherwise dark sky, offering a kind of calm illumination without overwhelming clarity. The night itself, a vast desert plain under a slow-moving moon, provides a fitting backdrop for this reflection. Imagine the cool sand stretching endlessly, each grain as tiny and discreet as a fragment of a forgotten ritual or hymn. Ancient worshippers might have settled on such a plain, their voices low and rhythmic as they called the wind by the name of Enlil, or spoke of light and shadow as Mani once did. This landscape, silent except for a gentle breeze, mirrors the way extinct religions speak to us now, partly heard, partly lost, yet deeply resonant. What I find interesting is that many of these traditions combined ritual and philosophy in ways modern life rarely does. The Sumerians, for example, did not separate their daily tasks from their gods. The act of baking bread or weaving reed mats was itself an offering, a small gesture connecting the mundane to the divine. Similarly, the lines of the Kesh temple hymn, composed in cuneiform on clay tablets that bear the rough texture of ancient hands, reveal a world where breath and wind were sacred forces, as tangible as the cool air slipping through a reed fence on a Mesopotamian evening. If you're still up and listening, feel free to like and subscribe. It helps out big time with the algorithm. The materials used in these religious expressions, clay, papyrus, metal, carved stone, carry their own stories. The Meroitic script, still undeciphered despite the smooth surfaces of its inscriptions, reminds us how much remains just out of reach. These artifacts often survived because of practical durability: the fired brick temple walls, the stone statues worn by centuries of sandstorms, the metal mirrors polished by hands long vanished. Yet their meanings, like the starlight filtering through a thin zenith haze, are sometimes too faint to grasp fully. One practical truth about ancient religions is their reliance on repetition and ritual rhythm. Temple priests in places like Sumer or Nubia followed schedules set by solar and lunar cycles, measured carefully with water clocks or simple sundials. These routines created a predictable passage of time, a structure that grounded both community and cosmos. The odd thing is how this repeated practice, seemingly rigid, also allowed for a kind of meditative openness, a space where the divine and the human could meet in those quiet intervals between tasks. What makes this useful to remember today is that these teachings are not just dusty histories. They offer a gentle invitation to slow down and observe the ordinary with reverence. The Upanishads, for instance, spoke of meditation and inner knowledge in a way that still feels surprisingly accessible. Their words were preserved on palm leaves, often darkened by smoke from oil lamps. The physical effort of copying these texts a kind of devotion in itself. This materiality, the weight of the leaf, the faint smell of burnt wick, anchors the spiritual in the tactile world. a detail easily overlooked in modern digital reading. The philosophical echoes in extinct religions also include a recognition of mystery. Manichaeism, with its dualistic vision of light and darkness, did not pretend to resolve every question. Instead, it embraced paradox, holding both good and evil in tension. The faded murals and fragments of Manichaean texts found across Asia and North Africa speak to a faith that was at once universal and deeply particular, shaped by the demands of trade routes, political upheavals, and cultural exchange. The fact that it vanished so thoroughly reminds us that ideas, no matter how profound, require ongoing care to survive. Returning to these teachings at night, beneath an open sky, offers a kind of rest for the mind. There is no need to decode every symbol or fully reconstruct ancient belief systems. Rather, simply allowing their presence to settle can ease the restless churn of modern thought. The stars, the slow turning of the moon, the faint sound of wind threading through desert grasses. All these remind us that human wonder and seeking are as old as breath itself. I find it interesting how extinct religions often leave behind more questions than answers. The gaps in knowledge, the undeciphered texts, the lost ritual steps. They invite patience rather than certainty. This uncertainty can feel like a quiet companion in the night, a gentle counterpoint to the demand for immediate understanding that so often fills our waking hours. It's a reminder that some mysteries are not problems to be solved, but landscapes to inhabit, slowly and without hurry. One small practical note about these reflections. Revisiting ancient faiths in this way is less about recovery and more about presence. It's about noticing the materials. Clay tablets with sharp cuneiform marks. The faint residue of incense on temple stones. The careful strokes of a reed pen over palm leaf. And letting these details anchor us in a moment outside of time. The part that feels strangely human is how these vanished religions once shaped everyday life, weaving the sacred into the fabric of the ordinary. As we close this chapter, the night sky remains vast and patient, its silence a kind of invitation. Perhaps another evening will bring a return visit to these old stories, where the simple act of listening can bring new calm. And as we pause here, feel the calm of these timeless teachings, gently guiding you toward restful sleep.